So it's autumn winter 2020 and it's time to create something to wear using 1 meter of fabric. Also, it's going to be high street inspired. Hi, my name is Juliet Uzor of sewsonatural.com, where we work together to demystify the art of sewing clothes, and you are absolutely welcome. Okay, so I did share some projects in the summer using 1 meter of fabric, and I also shared another video here on the channel of me creating something, getting inspiration from a ready-to-wear brand, and the support was absolutely amazing, and I just had to bring it back for autumn winter. So today we're going to be working with this fabric here. Okay, so I got this from the sale section of the Fabric Godmother website. She had just 1 meter of fabric left, and I like this fabric because it's a jacquard fabric with cotton with a bit of a stretch in it. So I don't know whether to call it a cotton sateen fabric that has a jacquard effect. It's sort of mid-weight, slightly heavyweight as well. I just don't know how to class this fabric, but I know that I have 1 meter of fabric. It's quite wide. So if you're wanting to create something to wear using 1 meter of fabric, just aim for fabric that is a bit more wide. Inspiration time. Okay, so I've decided to draw inspiration from this image here, and it's from Topshop. I found it on Pinterest. I love Pinterest, absolutely love Pinterest, and I think you should follow me on Pinterest. I'll leave my link in the description box below. It's a top, and I don't think this top here would require too much to it. I am also going to be using one of my sleeves from my statement sleeve bundle on my website, link in the description box as well, and I'm going to just quickly use my basic bodice, which I think everyone should have a basic bodice from an old sewing pattern you already have, or one that you've drafted by yourself, or you can get one from my website as well. Shameless plugs everywhere, but yeah, you can get one from my website, and we're going to use that to create a new pattern that we'll use to create this top. And this top, I would like mine to be just a little bit, just slightly loose, so that when I tuck it in, it would have a bit of a poofy effect. And yeah, the sleeves will be puffy at the sleeve cap, but then it will taper down as it goes down to the wrist. So yes, let's get started. So whenever I do my projects, I always start off by tracing out my basic sewing pattern and making the marks for the darts. I divided my hip measurement into 4 parts, and that was going to be the width around my hip. So I have got it at 11 inches, but then I extended the basic bodice down to about 7.5 inches because I don't want it to be too long. I want it to stop exactly at my hip. So now I've marked out exactly where I want the width of the hip. That was divided by 4, and then I extended the top. So what I'm doing here now is I'm marking the darts. I already made a mark using a pin to show exactly where the dart points should be. I went with about 2 centimeter hem. And then it's always important to mark the grain line direction. So what with the back, I've done the same thing. I've traced out the back paper pattern and made the mark for the darts. So now I've extended it again by about 7.5 inches, just like the front one. And I've gone with, I think I made the back one about 12 inches because it has a back seam allowance. I've extended the top and made that you see that point there is a bit pointed, so I've made it a bit curved using my curved ruler. Now I'm now going to draw out the darts, and okay, so the top half of the pattern has the dart stopping at a certain position, so I extended it by about 3.5 inches because I don't want it to be such a fitted top. And I've also made the darts to be wide by about 1.5 centimeters. That's why it looks different here. But it's basically just to make sure that the top isn't too fitted. That's why I went with this size of a dart. But then I forgot something. You can see me getting really frustrated here. It happens. I forgot to add seam allowance to the front pattern piece because this is not going to be cut on the fold. So I added about 3.75 of an inch to the front pattern piece at the center front so that I'll be able to have buttons. And then I also remembered that I didn't include a hem to the back pattern piece. So yeah, I mean, it's part of the frustrations of creating clothes from scratch, but hey ho. So now I'm onto the facing. With the facing, I'm tracing around just the top part of the back pattern piece. Now I'm going to make it at about 3.5 inches up to the shoulder seam. So I'll make the shoulder seam about 3.5 inches, just like there, and then just draw the curve and extend that line to make sure it's exactly 3.5 inches all around. And then I'm marking the back seam allowance. Now it's time to cut out this fabric, and you would see that this fabric has a little bit of a stretch, so I needed to make sure that the stretch was going along the width of the fabric, so around my body. I needed it to be like stretchy across and not down, like along, if that makes sense. Anyway, here I'm messing around with my pattern papers or my pattern pieces just to make sure that things fit nicely. I ended up finding out that I'll be able to cut out these pattern pieces, and I'm super excited here because I'll be able to cut out the back pattern piece on the fold. So I cut off that seam allowance and cut out the back pattern piece on the fold. But then in the long run, I think I shouldn't have done that. But I mean, you live and you learn. So yeah, so I've got the pattern, the back and the sleeve are comfortably fitted on the fabric piece. But then when it got to the front pattern piece, you see what happens. So I've cut out my back pattern pieces and my sleeves, but then now it's time to cut out the front pattern piece, and guess what, the fabric wasn't long enough. That's so frustrating. So I had to do some joining. I had to do some cutting and joining. So I've joined up 2 pieces of fabric along the width, if that makes sense, so that the fabric retains its stretch. Yeah. So I gave it a good press just to make sure everything was nice and flat. The joys of sewing. I love pressing. I don't mind it actually. Okay, so with the front one, you do not need, well, I didn't need to cut it on the fold, so it was okay to just have it there in the middle. Well, not really in the middle, but yeah. I think I have 3/4 of an inch as a front seam allowance along the center front, so that I'll be able to have a nice space for my buttons and buttonhole. Yeah, so it's all cut out, everything's cut. Well, the main pieces are cut out, but I needed some facings. So now I've cut out my neck facing for the back of the top without the seam allowance, because now I've been able to cut out the back pattern piece on the fold. So I needed to cut out the back facing on the fold. And you just need one on the fold. So I'm doing a bit more joining here so that I'll be able to get the long facing of the top. So I'm tracing out the front piece so that I'll be able to create a facing that would run all the way around the neckline down to the hem of the top. And I'm going still with that 3.5 inch width for the facing, and you know, it goes all the way round the neckline and down the center front of the top to the hem.
I just wanna dance with you. Feeling that burn, I'm not getting out. Yeah, yeah.
And then I'll join my dots and create the curve. The secret with creating curves is to make sure that your hand is nice and flat on the table. Well, that bone that you've got at your wrist, you want to make sure it's nice and flat on the table and stable, and that would enable you to create a good curve. A bit of practice would also help. Can you see all that joining? I joined it here and pressed it, definitely pressed. Give it a nice steam press to make sure your joints are, just to make sure that your joints look seamless, even though they've got seams in them. I enjoyed this project because it involved a lot of felt like I was trying to fabricate, like create new fabric out of scraps, but it was quite fun. And I'll later on show you the pieces that were left out of that entire piece of fabric that we started off with. It was a good project. So everything's cut out now and I can get started. Now these are our scraps, and I have a little 6-year-old in this house who loves scrap fabric. Okay, so we need to stabilize the neckline by cutting out interfacing. I went with a woven interfacing, and with interfacing, it's advisable to cut out interfacing that is the same color or as close as possible to the fabric you're working with. So I've got a black interfacing that I am pressing onto my facings.
Baby, you make me lose my mind. Maybe you wanna stay the night.
So whilst the interfacings were cooling down, I then moved on to the darts. So I've gone with tailor's tacking because I quite like this for these shaped darts, and I've gone with yellow thread, so I'll be able to tell where exactly I want the darts to go. Tailor's tacks are quite good. Do a bit of a Google search and learn a bit more about how to create tailor's tacks. They're not so hard. They're just, if you follow my steps, all I'm doing is I'm sewing through the paper and through the fabric, and I do not pull the thread all the way through. And it enables me to tell exactly where my darts, the essential parts of my darts are. And then I could use a piece of chalk and ruler to make those markings. This dart style was just at the back. Remember, I didn't go for any darts in front. The only dart I had in front was along the bust. I didn't go for waist darts in front because remember, I opted for the really loose look. I didn't want a very fitted top. That's why. I'm so old school that I could never ever get used to using the blade or scissors option on my sewing machine. I always have to use my pair of scissors to cut threads. Call me old school, I don't mind. I just can't get used to it. Yeah, so now I'm going to join the shoulder seams. After joining the shoulder seams, I would be ready to create the sleeves and attach them using my favorite flat construction method. But before we do any of that, it's so important to do any important pressing at this point. I'm extending my stitch length to the longest on my sewing machine and sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches all around my sleeve cap from one notch to the other. I've got 2 rows now, and then I'm just going to pull them through to form a nice puff. You see that? Look how lovely those sleeves look at the sleeve cap. I love them. So now, using the flat construction method, we are going to attach the gathered sleeve onto the armhole of the top, so the front and back bodices that have been stitched together. This takes a lot of time, you know. It was whilst I was editing it that I thought, my goodness, I didn't realize how long it took for me to faff around with those gathers and make sure they were nice and evenly spread out. But it's worth it. Honestly, it really is worth it. The trick is to make sure that the notches are matched. Once you have your notches matched exactly where they're supposed to be matched, everything else kind of falls into place. It just requires a bit of pushing, pulling here and there, not like pushing and pulling, but adjusting the gathers. And now we're going to have that lovely gather at the shoulder. Oh, look at that. Gives me joy. Yeah, so I didn't show me actually stitching because I felt like I'd done a lot of stitching in this video. But then I'd taken it to the sewing machine and sewn along the sleeve cap. Well, I stitched the sleeve onto the top and then I sewed down the side seams, and you can see now that the side seams are all stitched up and the dots are pressed, and that's join that I got that join that I had right there in front was also pressed, and the sleeves being attached and sewn up. Everything's looking good and clean as well because I overlocked the raw edges. But you don't have to feel pressured to overlock the raw edges of yours. You could use a pair of pinking shears or use the overcasting foot on your sewing machine to zigzag the raw edges. So we have our facings stitched together now, and it's time to attach them to the neckline to the neckline of the top. So I'm making sure that they match at the seams. Yeah, the facing and the actual top match at the shoulder seams properly. And then it's time to do some pinning. After pinning, it will then be time to sew. The seam allowance of this pattern was set 1 centimeter, so I opted for a 1 centimeter seam allowance and stitched all the way around. But then after stitching, you see that I should have turned it around so you'd see how ugly it looked on the other side. So that seam allowance there, that 1 centimeter seam allowance, I then snipped into. I don't have a big snip that can cut through this these layers of fabric. That's the reason why I'm using my chunky scissors, and I'm cutting off the bulk at the seams as well. So what I'm doing is I'm clipping into the seam allowance to allow the neckline to sit nice and flat. And also, you see this corner here? It's sent from hell. If you do not trim that corner there, you would end up with such a messy point, if that makes sense. And you just want it to look nice and pro-made. So what I did was I used a blunt object just to poke out that corner, and I am now understitching. Yes, I am understitching just to make sure that the seam allowance is facing the facing. Just to make sure that I stitch down the seam allowance to the facing and make sure everything lays nice and flat. you would also notice that I got to one point. So when I got to a corner, I stopped, cut the threads, and started again down the rest of the facing, because you want to sew into tight corners and not out of them or around them.
Looking so sweet, but you're dynamite. I just wanna dance with you. Feeling that burn, I'm not getting out.
So now look how nice and flat that neckline looks. Well, I take it an extra step by doing a stitch in the ditch. Stitch in the ditch is when your stitches go right at the middle of that seam. So I have my pins there, and I did a stitch in a ditch, which I didn't really film, but it was just to secure that facing so it doesn't peek out. I went for a 2 centimeter hem, like I said earlier, and I am using this trusty old ruler of mine. This ruler is so good because I am able to apply heat to it. So here is my top. Everything's matching nicely. I have the hem folded over and I sewed it up, and now I am ready for my buttonhole. So I went with, I think it was a 15mm button, so I had to make sure that my buttonholes were large enough, and well, not too large and not too small for the 15mm buttons.
Maybe you wanna stay the night. Time goes fast, I don't care.
So with my trusty old buttonhole maker, I was able to create buttonholes. But then take it to the next step. We need to now determine where the buttons actually go. I have shown exactly how I get this done in a full video dedicated to buttonholes and buttons. I'll leave the link to that in the description box below. But guess what I didn't share then, because I didn't know that. I didn't know this trick, but now I know it and I'm sharing with you. I discovered the fantastic thing called a sellotape you used for securing a button if you are to use a sewing machine to attach your buttons. Check that out. It doesn't move. My goodness, I saw this trick online on a blog somewhere, and I had to test it out and share it with you. So look at my top. My top is nice and complete and I absolutely love it. Such a shame that I only got 1 meter in the sale section. My sister-in-law, as soon as she saw this top, she was like, "You are making me one." And I was like, well, if you find the fabric, I'll make it for you. But yes, thank you so much for your time, and I do hope to see you in another video. Enjoy the rest of your day and all the very best. Take care. Bye.
You and I, we can stay inside.